to introduce our moderator for the plenary, a man with impeccable timing, Ron Sims. He was appointed by President Obama and unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the Deputy Secretary for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2009 to 2011. At HUD, he managed day-to-day operations of 8,500 employees and an operating budget of nearly $40 billion. Prior to the call from President Obama, he served for 12 years here in Washington as the King County Executive. And King County, if you don't know, is the 13th largest county in the country with 1.8 million people and houses the cities of Seattle, Bellevue, and Redmond. He was naturally recognized for his groundbreaking work on climate change, healthcare reform, affordable housing, environmental protection, and social justice. He was appointed in 2011 by Washington State Governor Chris Gregoire to the Puget Sound Leadership Council. That is a state group that is charged with restoring the state's largest estuary. Born in Spokane, he is a graduate of Central Washington University. And my personal favorite experience with Ron Sims is we had a small conference on ocean acidification, and Ron got up and challenged all of the scientists to do something about it. And 3 months later, we had the governor's panel on ocean acidification and report. So he is a person who makes things happen. Welcome.
It is really great being here this morning, and I didn't want Nicole to worry, so I pulled in behind a State Patrol officer who was moving quickly down the freeway, and I just followed them and saying, they won't stop and get a ticket. So it worked out very, very well. But it is really, really, really great being here this morning. And I saw Nicole just kind of, he's here. It's really interesting being back in Washington, D.C., because I first went back and I thought, well, they're going to limit me to the role as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which was a lot of fun. And our real issue was to get out of our silos very, very quickly, so we struck within the first 2 weeks we were there in a new agreement with the Environmental Protection Agency, another one with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and then subsequently one with Health, Housing, and Human Services, Education, and the Department of Energy. And the idea was that no issue can stand alone, that we actually had to work across those silos that had been structured for years. They were concrete structures, very impenetrable. People had a lot of habits. It was different. You don't massage concrete. So our goal was to work outside of those and raise issues that we thought would have profound impacts on the country now and in the future. And one of the things that we did note and has been widely discussed, even when we got assigned to work in work groups. I was in Council of Environmental Quality, was very, very great about asking me to work on work groups. It was a group of us that were considered to be kind of people who were free thinkers, who would gather and then therefore instruct our staffs to look at not only the future in this country and issues that we would have, but around the world as well. And one of the things that was very obvious to all of us is that nearshore environments are changing very, very, very rapidly. Matter of fact, at light speed. That if you look at the world today, that's where people are migrating. And the reason why is, as a human species, we've always done that. We've always managed to feel freer and safer the closer we are to an abundance of water and natural resources. And the real issue is, can you choose which one is more important? The governor, when I got back from my tenure at HUD, I loved HUD. My family did not move, so living on the East Coast when your family's on the West Coast and arriving every 3 weeks at the Alaska Airlines at 8:30 and then leaving on Alaska Airlines at 2:30 means I felt like a visitor, and my family began to treat me as one. So it came a time where I wanted more permanence in my life and a relationship. So I moved back to Seattle. But it was interesting coming back because Governor Gregoire was very gracious to say to me, I want you to be a regent at Washington State University, but first you have to agree to be on the Puget Sound Leadership Council, which I did. It's interesting, I have green credentials, and people just assume that, and rightly so, that my issues were what things are affecting the biological vibrancy of the Puget Sound, what can we do about it, what kind of land use measures, what kind of things should we be thinking about, how can we, after years and years and years and years and decades of neglect, recover the sound. So people just looked at me intuitively and said, Ron Sims really wants to go back to a period of time that we had far more trees on the Sound, and we had all these other more natural functioning systems. But I think I surprised by people by saying, no, actually, we've always had working waterfronts. That's what human beings do. We look at where our economy is robust, and we realize that waterfronts are absolutely critical to the economic welfare of communities and of states and of this country, and that being smart about them is important to not only this country but to the rest of the world. So I look at this conference, and I hope that you're realizing that don't look at issues of waterfronts in isolation. Look at how incredibly important they are to human welfare. That we have to find that sweet part of the baseball bat. And I always say it's a sweet part of the baseball bat because if you've ever played baseball, you realize there's one part of the baseball bat and a kind of pitch you can hit. It's slow. Now, even in a fastball game where the pitcher is coming at you at 90 miles an hour, there comes a moment where the ball seems so slow. And you have a bat that seems so perfect that you realize that it is crunch time. Hit it. Just hit it. It will slowly go off your bat. And then you will have the sweet, sweet thrill of watching it go over a fence. And having people say to you, even when you're losing, that was a nice home run. So what we're looking for you to do is to find that sweet part of the baseball bat and hit the ball that we pitch to you because you are innovative and you are imaginative and you are smart. There is no such thing as an issue being outside of your capacity to mold and shape. You can't argue that. We have constantly found ways to reshape what we do, to look at what we do, and to do it better. So that there is going to be that marriage between the biology of this incredible Puget Sound and all water areas. I don't care whether it's Great Lakes, whether it's Chesapeake, whether it's the Florida Everglades, whether it is what's happening in California and Oregon and other places where we have commerce on waters. There is no such thing as one or the other. The issue is how do we merge the interest of both and do it incredibly, incredibly well. So I want you to take the science of the panel I'm going to be talking about, which is going to be hazard resilience and what it means for working waterfronts. Hazard resilience. Somebody says, how can you have a hazard and have resilience? Well, in fact, you can have hazards and you can have resilience. The issue is to be smart, both to prevent them, to mitigate them, and in the end, figuring out a way to restore. That's the challenge they have, but you have smart people, and all of you are. I was walking in downstairs very calmly, trying to catch my breath and rethink, because you're going to have these great speakers. And I was looking at all of the sessions you're going to be having today that are now posted on the rooms downstairs. I would say, whoa, this is a lot of heavy. You guys use words that I don't understand. They're spelled with length and all of that. And I was going, these are really going to be fascinating. I always tell my kids that to look at something you don't understand is the session you need to attend. Don't attend what you already know. Attend what you can learn from. We're going to have a panel that come up in just a few minutes. And I want to, and there's things I'm going to ask them to do. They're going to quickly introduce themselves, although I'm going to introduce them as well. But they're going to kind of introduce themselves. But when they finish, one of the things that I don't want to do is to, because I have only had 2 cups of coffee this morning, is to actually think of questions to ask them. So on your desks, you will see a notepad. And rather than have me, who lacks caffeine, and so therefore I probably will not come to an earthly consciousness for a few more minutes, I want all of you to think of questions that you would ask them, because they are a panel prepared to do that. But I want to charge you with something. Life is short. It really is. It really is. Every day is a gift. It's to be living robustly, with enthusiasm, with interest, with excitement. You know, I always say to my kids, yes, I am the last Sims member from 1218 East 5th Avenue. I never thought that. I think everybody thought I'd go first, considering all my habits. I got hit by a car, fell out a car door in North Dakota, got hit by a car in Curtin, ran off the road in college, and I still am the last one standing. But I have a great appreciation for what life is. For what life is. I have a granddaughter who's perfect. She says the magic word, "I love you, Grandpapa," and I say the magic reply, "Yes." So when my son protested that I in fact feed her or allow her to eat ice cream and cake for breakfast, I said to him, "Yes, I did." He said, "Why'd you do it?" I said, "Because she asked for it." He said, "But you never let us do that." And I says, "But I'm not raising her." But I did subscribe to his desire no longer to allow her to have ice cream and cake. And I said to her, "I love you, Amina. I love you, Amina. Don't tell your dad what you eat." So I want her world to be better than mine. That's all I want. My grandfather got on a train with his brother at 14, my grandfather at 12, and left South Carolina on a freight train and ended up in New York. I knew of my grandfather. All I knew is that he cleaned people's homes all of his life, and he repaired things. He had 2 kids, and my father went to Lincoln University because Princeton had racial quotas when my father went to school, and so therefore they were sent to Lincoln University. And my Aunt Mary was on the team that helped invent the transistor. I remember a discussion among the 2 of them because my Aunt Mary was teasing my father by saying that he got an A- in 3rd grade, and she never tainted any of her A's with a minus. I did not follow my father's footsteps nor my Aunt Mary's of perfection from kindergarten, from 1st grade through their master's degrees, where they only got A's. But I told my father he was the greatest man I'd ever met. He says, "Your grandfather was the greatest man you ever met." He said, "Your grandfather saw his role as preparing a household where his kids' lives would be better and that they could aspire." So all of you in your tasks are not just a task for today, and the gift you've been given of life today is not just for today. It's to dream about a world that will be better for your grandchildren, if you have them and if they are to come, so that they will look back and say, life is good. They will have new challenges. The people who will be on this panel today are going to be Eric Holdeman, who's a principal at Eric Holdeman and Associates. And Eric, come up. I've known Eric for a very, very long time, when he pulled together all of the activities that made King County one of the best jurisdictions in the United States prepared for an emergency of any kind. And he trained us and trained us and trained us. And I used to say, I am tired of being trained about emergencies. Then I had to go back to the federal government and say, you need to talk to Eric Holdeman because you guys are doing it wrong. But he is absolutely stellar in his work. We have Bill Needelman, senior planner, City of Portland, Maine. And I'd like for him to come up. We have Steve Goldbeck, Chief Deputy Director of San Francisco's Waterfront. And we have Senator Kevin Ranker, one of my really favorite senators, but maybe I'm not supposed to politic from up here, but he is really good. I'm going to ask each of them just to give a short introduction to who they are, and then what I'm going to ask them to do is to give, to respond to the question of what are we going to do with hazard reduction, and then they can ask each other questions as well. They can feel free to do that. And then I'm going to ask all of you to actually write questions that I can ask them so people will think I'm smart. Okay. I will start off with, I have a deep admiration for elected officials. I no longer want to be one. As my wife said, after 25 years of being in office and having absolutely no privacy and being owned by everybody, that it was time for me to think of something else to do, like family. So but although I think my kids called me an annoyance. They always said my best gift I ever got from them was a Christmas card that said, "To our dad, who was always there whether we wanted him there or not." But it is a noble profession, and it always is refreshing when we can have people like the mayor who is here, who is my favorite mayor in all of the United States. I used to brag about her all of the time. And so we have a mayor here today and a state senator here today who exemplify, I think, the very best of being a public official. Senator.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay if this is further away? Okay, great. I'm Kevin Ranker. I'm a Washington State Senator. I represent Northern Puget Sound, the incredible ports of Anacortes and Bellingham, and more waterfront than any other district in the state, mainly because I represent the San Juan Islands, so every single nook and cranny up there is waterfront, which is also, by the way, just a sidebar, our nation's newest national monument. I'm incredibly proud of that. Thank you, President Obama. For about 20 years now, I'm not sure when it was I became middle-aged, but I've been doing something for 20 years. I've been working on coastal and ocean policy, everything from fisheries policy to waterfront management to conservation to research. And for me, about 15 years ago, I kind of found this niche, which was this combination of economic development and prosperity in coastal communities and conservation, and how can we combine those? And that's really been my almost exclusive focus for quite some time. Until we lost the majority this year, I was chair of the committee responsible for all marine and coastal issues in the state. And I also, in that committee, was responsible for all energy and natural resource issues. And I actually had difficulty turning around and realizing that there was something behind the beach. I'm usually standing on the beach looking outward. And it was difficult for me to all of a sudden be responsible for forestry, for instance, when that was not my passion or niche. But what I realized, and has been mentioned by the previous speakers, is it's all connected, and it's connected intrinsically, and it's something that we have to focus on. Those watershed connections for conservation, those land-sea connections for environmental issues, but also those critical economic drivers that are related between, yes, I don't care if you're in the wheat fields in Kansas, you still have an impact and are impacted by decisions on the coastline. So I'll stop it there and make some comments in a bit.
Next for a 1-minute introduction, and then what they're going to do is they're going to come up, because some of them have presentations and give presentations, but I want you just to give a glimpse of who you are. Bill Needelman.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. My name is Bill Needelman. I'm one of the senior planners for the city of Portland, Maine. And when Nicole asked me to join the plenary and she mentioned who else would be up here, I said, "Really, Nicole? You do know what I do for a living." And so I feel very thankful for being, really an on-the-ground, close to the implementation level participant in this conference. And I think that that perspective that we can bring as local officials to a national conversation is valuable, and it's one that we just are thrilled to be able to provide. My practice in Portland with the City of Portland has given me the privilege of working on the waterfront and with waterfront planning issues in the town that I was born, in the town that my parents were born in, and 3 of 4 grandparents are born in. And that perspective allows that concept of change to really seep into my practice. And we've always, as a family, had connections to the islands and the waterfront in Portland. And it's a true privilege to be here and to be speaking on some of my experiences in Portland. Thank you.
Steve Goldbeck.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. Excuse me. Excuse me. Delighted to be here. I am the Chief Deputy at the Bay Commission. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I'm a regional planner by training. And I've always been fascinated with the interface of the environment, which I love, and also culture, which I also love, and have been working on working waterfronts most of my career. In fact, most of my early days for several decades was working on dredging issues in San Francisco Bay, which sounds really boring, but there was never a dull moment because it was so controversial and so important, both in terms of being able to dredge our ports and keep our waterways open, to keep our waterfronts vital, but also to protect the environment that we love. And so trying to find that balance is one of the things that I've tried to work on in my career. And just happy to be here. Thank you.
Eric Holdeman.
Well, good morning. I'm Eric Holdeman, and I've been working on disasters and the preparedness side, the resiliency side, recovery, what have you, for about 24 years, federal, state, local levels. One of my major emphasis is the regional aspect of that and this whole piece of interdependencies that I'll be talking about, and then breaking down these barriers between organizations and jurisdictions. And since I have the mic, I can talk about Ron Sims real quick, because I did work for him for about 11 years, and I think you can probably see Ron Sims is not bound by time, space, or job title and what he might be interested in. He is an idea machine, which we feared daily, because he'd walk in, I got an idea, we should be solving world peace and hunger as King County. True statement. And I used to call it trying to put the bell on the cat, so we knew where the cat was, what he was doing. I don't think we were ever successful, as evidenced by today. So.
I just followed staff lead. I used to have a phrase, and I lived by it. If you take a risk and you succeed, I will sing your praises to the end of the world. And Eric was being very humble when he asked us to build a brand new emergency facility. And I said, why would we do that? The existing one seems just fine. It's cozy, a little frail. That's kind of the antique quality to it. And we ended up building this remarkable facility. So I want to thank him for his incredible leadership. But if you take a risk and you succeed, I'll sing your praises to the end of the world, I used to tell people. If you take a risk and you fail, I will applaud you to the end of the world. But if you take no risk at all, I was going to make it your most miserable workday. Because we are a people who constantly adapt and explore and take risk and do not say anything's impossible. We achieve on a constant basis. That was the environment I tried to create. Now, there were times when things didn't go as well as I would like them, so I used to tell staff, is it just going to hurt when I hit the bottom of this abyss? I mean, is it going to really hurt? They would say, no, we'll have pillows and mattresses and cushions for you. And then when you hit the bottom, you said, okay, let's climb to the top of the mountain again. And that's what we are going to ask you to do. Not be perfect, but to take risks, to think outside of the box and do glorious things. Now I would like to have Steve Goldbeck from San Francisco do the first presentation. And Nicole, no one ever, Eric first? Okay, Eric first, because no one has ever, there's an order here, you want me to follow it. That's, right? Not fair. So since I don't know, nobody's ever told me to go near a computer and have it work on a consistent basis, I'm going to ask all of you gentlemen to kind of influence this piece of technology. That's my picture.
Okay, so following the congressman's lead there, I'm going to talk very briefly about resiliency and this interdependence. And, you know, resiliency is kind of like sustainability. A lot of you are planners around, and it took a long time, and perhaps a debate still is going on about what is sustainability in that. Resiliency is the same thing. I think we're having a tough time figuring what does that mean. So I'm going to talk to the lowest common intellectual denominator present in the room, and that's me. So we have, for a long time, I think, been prevention-focused. Building things, and this is a steel rod, stronger, higher, be that a dike, a levee, a seawall, whatever it is, to try and contain, in many respects, nature from a natural disaster standpoint. And so this is a steel rod, and with enough pressure and force, of course, we could bend it, break it, just like the Japanese tsunami wall that they built for the maximum credible event they thought could happen in Japan. You know, they thought they had the strongest thing possible, yet it failed. It broke. So resiliency, then, is the idea that we don't have to necessarily be strong. You know, we can be able to spring back, you know, to a better future. But resiliency isn't itself a solution. I think we actually have to have think about resiliency in a stronger way, something that returns not to, and I've been looking for a different type of spring to do this, but not to the present state, not where we are today, but to a better tomorrow, a different tomorrow. And that's very difficult, just given federal laws and regulations. A lot of it's all driven by going back to where you were already. And that necessarily wasn't a good place to be to just start with. So the United States, if you haven't figured it out, is focused on short-term thinking. I was thinking about this because I saw a gravestone flash up on my screensaver. My great-great-grandmother was born in 1833, 7 years after Thomas Jefferson died. My great-great-grandmother. We are not that old as a nation. We think in our lifetime. Every disaster, go watch it on the news. They'll have some old codger on there saying, I lived here all my life and I've never seen anything like this. But from a geological, climatological perspective, it's a blink of an eye for our lifetime. You know, we talk about 100, 500-year floods. In the Netherlands, they're planning for 10,000-year floods. Can you imagine going to Congress and saying, we need to plan for the 10,000-year flood? You know, it's not in our culture. I think it's part of being American and only having a 300-year history for that. The complexity of our society. You guys are out there. Now, we were talking about what would it take to replace the locks between Lake Washington and Puget Sound today, where you actually stop a river from flowing and impact fish and other habitat. Would not happen. I mean, the complexity that goes in to today, the interdependencies and interconnectedness of us, whether it's in our individual community, the nation, and the world, the globalization aspect of today. And at the altar of efficiency, we are sacrificing redundancy. A lot of people, I hear them talk about redundancy as though it's duplication. Duplication is waste. Redundancy provides some flexibility in the system, but just-in-time delivery. Lean and mean aspect to it has taken out the robustness, and we really have a very fragile system, whether it's a maritime system or any other system that's functioning today, it's fragile. And I would just like to touch on the fact that, you know, collaboration is the big word today. Be careful when you use that word collaboration. We're replacing the words information sharing, coordination, partnering with the word collaboration. I see it with the feds. No offense, former Fed. I was a Fed once. You know, they say, we want to collaborate with you. No, they don't. They just want to tell you what they're going to do. So let's be frank, you know, with what it is. It gets us in trouble, doesn't it, when we use the wrong word there? So know whether you really want to inform somebody, this is what I'm going to do. You don't give a rip what they're going to do. Or I want to coordinate with you. I want to tell you what I'm going to do. You tell me what you're going to do. Or we're going to partner, or really we're going to start with a blank sheet of paper and collaborate. Now, there's a lot of top-down emphasis of all this, but the real work where the rubber hits the road is right here, in that local community, in the individual business, in the development aspect of it. So, Mississippi River, you know, as mentioned, and one thing a farm boy always has is common sense. I have not met a successful farmer who does not have common sense. Trust me on that. You won't find a farmer that's still farming that doesn't have common sense from that. But the impacts of the river, Mississippi River, and the drought there, watch that ripple through our nation here in the next 6 months, 12 months, what have you. All that grain, and reduced amount of grain because of the drought, has to go somewhere. But the system is set up. It's a pipeline. It's lean. It's mean. There isn't a lot of redundancy there. It's going to have to adapt to that. So when we talk about ports, there isn't a more dependent type of business or function than ports. If you don't have electrical power, those cranes you see, those big cranes, there's not a generator made that will power those cranes. None. Zero. There's no emergency power for the crane. You got to have electrical power. If you don't have the rail system working, if you don't have the road transportation system working, if you don't have longshore to load or unload those ships, it ain't happening. Highly interdependent from that standpoint. These modern terminals that, you know, we're talking about, ships are getting bigger and bigger. That, you know, post-Panamax, I think, is about 12,500 TEUs. They're talking about 18,000 TEU ships are being built now. They're planning for 24,000 TEU ships. A modern terminal, one's being built in Long Beach, Port of Long Beach now, is $1 billion. $1 billion. And another $500 million for equipment to operate that terminal. These are huge investments that I hope someone's thinking about sustainability, redundancy, and climate change for. Now, what are ports doing about sea rise? I don't think, not a whole lot. Now, they're working on the mitigation aspect of this and climate change because of air quality. Air quality has been a big deal here on the West Coast. So you got low sulfur fuels, you got cold iron where you plug the ship into shore power so they don't have to run on diesel fuel or from that standpoint. We're looking at LNG. You're going to see a whole lot more happening on LNG, at least on the West Coast in Puget Sound. One of the ocean carriers, Tote, that goes to Alaska, is converting their ships. The Washington State Ferries wants to convert one of their class of ferries, the Issaquah class, to LNG because it's cleaner burning. So they're working on it from a mitigation standpoint of air quality, and then, you know, long term that affects everything. So adaptation, the idea of planning for the future. I had a quote, heard an executive make not that long ago, here in 2013. Before we do anything, we need to know what the facts are. Before we do anything, we need to know what the climate, you know, what's the impacts, what's really going to happen. And I would ascribe to, there's lots of debate what's really going to happen there. Hopefully these panelists can inform you better than I can, but we can't wait to know what the facts are. We're going to have to make some planning assumptions as communities, whether it's a worst case or something in between there, and start planning for it, because the as-built isn't going to be able to cut it for the type of climate change and sea rise that we're seeing. Here in this region, December 17th, we had what's called a king tide, high tide, and we've seen damages at Port Tacoma and Port of Olympia from that, and there was not a storm event. I mean, the water was almost glad like a pond, and we had damage from that one king tide. As you get, whether it's 6 inches a foot or 4 feet of sea rise, we're going to have significant troubles if we don't start planning and acting today. And then I'd just like to say, let's watch what New York and New Jersey are going to do following Hurricane Sandy. I think that'll be an indicator. And what we have to do is stop rebuilding. We have to stop subsidizing bad behavior, putting it back the way it was. A lot of folks have never seen the play Little Abner. There's this song. Anybody know Little Abner? Seen? All right. Well, Daisy May sings put him back the way he was. We got to stop putting him back the way he was, where we are today. We need to plan for the future. And the federal programs drive a lot of what we do and trying to influence that from that standpoint. So we need to stop fighting the water, trying to protect against it, and learn to live with water. The storms of today, those storms of today are really the tides of tomorrow. And look forward to your questions and the rest of the panel's remarks. Thank you.
One of the things that the group of us who were working in CEQ recommended was that we develop adaptation plans for every federal agency. And we finally arrived in an agreement between NOAA and NIMP. It's NOAA and actually everybody. NOAA agreed, NASA agreed, and so did DOD, as to the level of glacial melt around the world. And we developed maps based upon their agreement. So we can tell you with incredible accuracy today what's going to happen to any waterway and any waterway with incredible accuracy. And the federal government has released it. The president's getting some pushback from Congress, but science is what science is. Those maps are what maps are, and you should avail those if you haven't used them, because there are some cities that did not and have been surprised that their most recent investments on adaptation will be inconsequential on surge. I'd like to now introduce Bill Needelman.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to Portland, Maine. I think a lot of folks in this room are probably a little more familiar with the other Portland, our younger sister, who grew to be quite a bit larger than Portland, Maine. But in the map that you see up there, that's the aerial is the actual city of Portland, and you can see in the inset map down below that we're on the southwest coast, is what we call it. And so we're actually west coasters as well, because of the orientation of the coast of Maine, which runs northeast, southwest. So as you go towards Canada, we call that going down east, because that's in the downwind direction. If anybody has an opportunity to go to Maine, I do encourage it. It's a remarkable coastline, and it's been a tremendous pleasure for me to see a glimpse of the coastline that you have here in the Puget Sound region. I'm going to tell basically a story, and it's an anecdote which touches on this idea of are we ready for climate change and resiliency and hazards resiliency. And the story is that it's the day that FEMA came to town. It's important for me to say this. There's no villain in this story. There's no bad guy. FEMA, the city of Portland, and the state of Maine, everybody had a role to play. Everybody had a job to do. But FEMA came to town and said, we need to change the FIRM, the flood insurance rate map. And many folks here know what that is, but it's essentially the regulating tool that determines if you're in a floodplain, if you're out of a floodplain, and what insurance rates you'd need to pay if you actually are do want to get flood insurance. One of the important things to know about the firm is that if a local government does not adopt it, your community may not participate in flood insurance program. This is what we like to call the big stick. It's very important for our communities to be able to participate in a critical insurance program. And the federal government produces the maps, and periodically, in this case every 30 years, the map has been revised. And FEMA, to their credit, to their absolute credit, is updating what had been maps done on paper with very little information other than the lines themselves 30 years ago on what was probably the best available topography and water level information available, but certainly not up to date. And they have applied a new digital model that they are now attempting to apply nationwide. It's a daunting task, and I believe that Portland was one of the beta communities. We're one of the early communities. And we're going to go, here's the peninsula of Portland. This is where our downtown is, and you see those wonderful finger piers. Most of those are privately owned piers. And the new firm map came out, and those piers had always been in the floodplain. Most of them are out over the water. But the floodplain changed from being a still water plain to a velocity zone. The V. You don't want to be in the V. The V is where the big waves are. The V is where damage happens, especially according to the FEMA regulations. And our local floodplain management laws say you can't build out over the water in a V zone. It's dangerous out there. And you can't reinvest in existing infrastructure past a certain percentage of its value, because it's dangerous out there. And we're looking at our harbor, and it's our entire working waterfront is in the V. And we're left with a choice. The process that FEMA establishes is that they provide draft maps. There's a period of time to comment on those maps. You can provide additional information. And then either the FEMA will change the maps according to that new information, or they'll just tell you to adopt the maps as they were provided. And we didn't know what to do. Our property owners, private property owners owning commercial piers on the waterfront that we had always required remain largely in working waterfront use, they were upset. The city government, who owned significant facilities along the waterfront, which were now at risk for not being able to invest in these piers, were upset. And it put us in a situation where we needed to fight the map in order to be able to create resilient infrastructure, because the infrastructure will only be resilient if we invest in it. And the law, our own local ordinance as required by the federal government, that you can't reinvest significantly in this infrastructure. And in the end, many hydrogeologists were hired. They put their kids to college, they bought boats, went on golf vacations. The FEMA was extremely gracious and reasonable in the light of new information, more detailed modeling, acceptance of the fact that the bottom conditions in a rocky shoreline are different than they might be in the Carolina coast. And a very detailed conversation resulted in amended maps that put the majority of our harbor back in the A zone, based on science, based on a better methodology. And in the end, it was a very long, a very painful, and at times uncomfortable conversation. and it went exactly the way it was supposed to. This was the design of the system. Revised maps, period for comment and new information, and then either a re-amendment or acceptance. But in the end, we don't have more resilient infrastructure. It took a couple years. It took a lot of money. We didn't make a lot of friends. We were termed climate change deniers. And I use this as an anecdote that to say that, you know, well, collaboration may not be everything it needs to be. We do need to have a common goal and a common set of values around this concept of hazards resiliency, where property owners, as regulated by their local governments, as regulated by their state governments, as regulated by their federal governments, have a common understanding of what the goal is. And it's not disinvestment. It's investment towards more resilient infrastructure and communities. And I really look forward to the conversation that we're about to have. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Steve Goldbeck.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I was asked to give a regional example of how we are responding to climate change and sea level rise in San Francisco Bay Area. So I will proceed, but this thing isn't working, so let's try this. All right, so here we are, the San Francisco Bay region, 7 million people strong and the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas. But it's actually a third smaller than it was at the time of the gold rush, when this was a sleepy little village of Yerba Buena in what's now San Francisco. And we started filling right about then when the ships came with the gold seekers, and they all abandoned the ships, and the ships were left there and got filled in and became downtown San Francisco and the working waterfront today of San Francisco. And that process accelerated, so we got better tools, bigger equipment, until at the end of the 50s, the Corps of Engineers showed a map of San Francisco Bay region that told us what it would look like if all the filling of all those areas susceptible of filling were indeed filled in. And the people of the region rose up and said, we don't want to live around the San Francisco Bay River, and formed the Save San Francisco Bay movement, which led to the creation of the agency that I work for, BCDC, to control the filling to fill that needs to be in the bay, to provide more public access to the shoreline, and to develop the shoreline in ways that are appropriate. And we've built a lot of very, very appropriate and beautiful and hardworking structures in the bay. We've approved projects that restored the bay. The bay is actually now larger than it was when the commission was established. And we have a lot of abundant and beautiful public access to the shoreline, so I guess we can pat ourselves on the back. But we now face a new challenge. We no longer have a shrinking bay from bay fill. We now have an expanding bay from sea level rise. This is at the tide gauge at the Golden Gate, showing 7 inches of sea level rise over the past 100 years. And we know that this is going to accelerate with global warming. We just don't know how much. And so our agency decided we needed to look at this new threat and respond to it. So we did a regional vulnerability assessment of what the risks are to the bay's natural resources and its built environment from sea level rise. And we used scenarios of 16 inches at 50 years, 55 inches at 100 years as a planning estimate. And USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, did the heavy lifting of the analysis for us. And it showed that over hundreds of square miles potentially are inundated from sea level rise, including, by the way, the airport that got me here, even at 16 inches, including a lot of people's residences. Over 250,000 residents living today in the San Francisco Bay would be at risk of flooding with all the hospitals and things upon which they depend. And then also our Silicon Valley. Google's corporate campus is in the area that could be inundated. Imagine if you Googled something and it said, sorry, we're underwater. Estimated cost just to replace the things that might be flooded is over $60 billion. And this isn't something that's going to happen a long ways away as storm events come on top of the sea level rise signal. You're going to see flooding. This is right in front of the Ferry Building in downtown San Francisco during a storm event today. And to show this, we overlaid the map of the 16-inch sea level rise with the 100-year floodplain and found that they're the same thing. So literally, today's flood is tomorrow's high tide. So our commission decided to adopt new policies to address sea level rise and climate change in the permit process that it oversees. As you might imagine, that was controversial. And it wasn't just the deniers of climate change and the people who didn't want to think about it. A lot of the folks who want to develop the shoreline with working waterfronts and a lot of productive development thought that this would dry up the economics and they wouldn't be able to build their projects. It would be dispiriting to the economic environment. And also, the local governments were concerned that why is BCDC trying to take over the jurisdiction of this inundation zone? And we realized that although we had done a good job of educating ourselves and a good job of going through our very transparent process to try to adopt these policies, what we hadn't done is educate the community as to what the risk is and what we needed to do about it. And that really is what the problem was. So we took 3 years, many public hearings, and we went around and met with every one of the 9 Bay Area counties, a lot of the cities, economic development groups, environmental groups, and talked about what the problem is and what we were trying to do about it. At the end of the process, the Commission unanimously adopted the new policies with support from the environmental, economic, and social equity communities. So what do these policies do? They require significant projects on the shoreline to do their own vulnerability assessment of what the risks are to them from sea level rise. And then they're supposed to do 2 things. First, the green line shows that out to around mid-century, sea level rise, it's rising, but it's not rising super fast. We can deal with it. That's about the lifetime of a lot of the investments folks are going to do on the shoreline. So people are required to be resilient in their projects to mid-century sea level rise. But then going out, sea level rise takes off. We don't know how much. So what they're required to do is have an adaptive management plan to manage the facility out to the end of 100 years. But we realized that a case-by-case, permit-by-permit approach isn't going to make the region resilient to sea level rise. So what we called for was a regional sea level rise strategy, not to be prepared by BCDC, but prepared by BCDC with the other regional agencies, the Associated Bay Area Governments, the transportation folks, and the Air Board. And most people think of fight or flight. We're either going to build a really big levee or we're going to get the heck out of Dodge. And what we realize is we need to live with water as well. And these are people living with water in Venice, Italy. This is a building in Hamburg that's resilient to sea level rise and flooding. So we did a design competition to get new ideas. But what we realized what we really needed to do was go into our own backyard and start thinking about how we would adapt to these changes. So we did the Adapting to Rising Tides project with a regional community. We picked the Alameda shoreline in the East Bay and started working with local governments, local communities, equity groups to do cooperative planning as to how we should do it. We partnered with a lot of folks, too numerous to mention, but I do want to shout out to NOAA and the Highway Administration, the federal folks, who helped fund it. But what we wanted to do was come up with a cross-sector and a cross-jurisdiction framework to deal with sea level rise, because flooding doesn't respect sectors and it doesn't reflect jurisdictions. So we need to work together. We needed to come up with new tools, and we wanted to figure out what should be done at the local level, what should be done at the regional level, and what we need at the state and federal level. And we decided that we needed to assess not only the economic aspects, but the environmental aspects, social equity, and we needed to address governance, but only at the end of the process when we figured out what the heck we need to do, so then we can figure out how the heck we're going to do it. I'm not going to go into the details. We did but much more detailed mapping and assessment of the subregion. And just as an example, we looked at the Port of Oakland, a working waterfront, and found, lo and behold, it's not vulnerable to most sea level rise until you get out to 100 years with big storms. But what we did find was that the rail access, as mentioned earlier, and a lot of the highways into it are going to be underwater. And the other regional ports can't take over their facilities even if they were resilient. And I couldn't help but have a real-world example, the first slide you'll see at the conference from Superstorm Sandy, of railroad tracks meeting a lot of water. And I just love this porta potty. How did that get into the middle of the picture? I mean, how convenient. So right now what we're doing is working with our local folks, not telling them what to do, but working with them to come up with community-based adaptation strategies of how to deal with these issues. For the port, the first step is really going to be to reach out and start working with the transportation folks, the rail folks, the highway folks, the local folks who have control of the roads, to come up with an approach even of how we're going to come up with adaptation planning that's going to make us resilient going forward. And what we're going to do is take these tools that we're designing, this palette of adaptation measures, to prepare our regional adaptation strategy. And in closing, I just want to say that that sounds really audacious and difficult, and it's going to be. We figured the planning could take over $20 million, not even to build anything. But we think just like back in the 1960s when the Save the Bay movement took this inevitable filling and came up with a new plan to be a thriving economy but protect our environment, we believe today that we can come up with a strategy to live around an expanding bay and still have a resilient economy and a wonderful environment. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Adaptation models are very, very important. I'll tell you two stories pretty quickly. When I was back in Washington, D.C., there was a group of us that were on the adaptation task force, 5 of us. And one of the things that we did in terms of working through the agreements with the satellite agencies and having their atmospheric scientists and physicists and everybody else agree to the level was to say that we had to count storm surge. I never forgot that. And so something very minor, HUD actually builds, finances public housing. And so we had a city in Texas that was going to locate housing in an area that we said would be destroyed by storm surge. Not just sea rise, but storm surge. And we fought them and we said, no, we have a map and we're going to follow that map and we are not going to put people in harm's way. And the other aspect was I remember asking the tough question, and I said to, in the middle of this meeting, I said, I just saw the maps. Somebody explain New Orleans because it just kind of goes, the Gulf goes into it but not out of it well. And I think it's important to acknowledge the importance of where you're going to make investments now. And the other one was in King County, where we're looking at a variety of things. The city of Seattle, Port of Seattle, we're looking at ports. We were looking at waterways, because we realized that we were going to not have we have snowpacks, but they're going to go up another 1,000 feet, so that we would have torrential rains that would flood our levees, which is why we're rebuilding our levees. So if you're in a waterway system or if you're in a port located near a major waterway, the key is to look at those maps and realize that you can debate causes of climate change till the cows come home. The fact is that we have to acknowledge that it's occurring and it will have consequence, and the issue is whether or not you're going to make smart, prudent investments that will allow you to remain economically viable, because the minute that you're overwhelmed by the problem, your economic viability changes very, very significantly. And to have a rebuild of something you could do cheaper now than you can do in 20 years, or you're going to have to spend billions of dollars more. It is prudent now for smart people and smart countries and smart communities to make investments that ensure their long-term ability to reduce impact and to be resilient. I'd like next to introduce our State Senator Steve Ranker, who I love because he's always cutting edge. He just reminds me of what I did when I was this young.
I was giving Ron a hard time for calling me Steve. That's classic. You owe me.
I do.
For a long time.
I do.
Just on a personal, is Lisa Cobb in the room? Where is Lisa Cobb? I heard her name mentioned earlier. All right, Lisa Cobb's from Oregon. She's amazing. And when one of you sees her, tell her I said hello, because I haven't seen her in years. So in the spirit of Ron Sims, I didn't do anything close to my assignment, and I wasn't planning on talking about disaster resilience really at all, but I think that there's a little bit of a connection between what I actually want to talk about, which is looking at everything we want to do through a political lens, and disaster resilience, because that actually does come together very clearly. And Mayor Strickland, you spoke about in your typical amazing way, frankly. I think you are an incredible mayor, and Tacoma is lucky to have you. But you spoke about the vision for our working waterfronts needing to be inclusive. And I think that is absolutely key. When we think about, well, let me back up. So I am, so as a politician, I'm supposed to say I'm a conservationist. I'm not an environmentalist. Screw that. I'm a staunch environmentalist. I want to do everything I can to protect our natural resources and the jobs that depend upon them. I want to do that because I have also a perfect little daughter. My daughter is perfect. And I also grew up on the beach looking out. And I want to do everything I can to make sure not just my daughter, but everybody's children and grandchildren love and enjoy the natural environment. And so when we look at our working waterfronts, we often think about the industrial side. We should also look at the recreational side, the commercial side. But my point with being a staunch environmentalist is, you know, we talk a lot in the environmental field about things that are endangered. Well, I would say that our working waterfronts are endangered, significantly endangered. We are going around losing industrial working waterfronts, and we're not going to replace those. We are looking at industrial waterfronts that you think if that gets restored, first of all, you could spend billions of dollars trying to restore an industrial waterfront, and you're never going to get it back to an ecological level that is significant. What we should do is spend that money to protect natural, I don't believe anything's really pristine anymore, unfortunately, but natural shorelines. But then what we should do is keep our industrial and commercial waterfronts as economic drivers for our communities. And I say that as a staunch environmentalist. This is something that is critical. We have got to come together and look at jobs versus the environment. No. It's jobs equals the environment. So let's talk about a couple of different types of working waterfronts. One are incredible ports like the Port of Tacoma, but because I represent the northern Puget Sound, let's talk about the Port of Bellingham or the Port of Anacortes with industrial working waterfronts that are critical. And then you also look at that recreational level. This is a real number, I think. I mean, I'm a politician, so never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So more of you should have laughed at that. Maybe that's just sad. I don't know. Okay. $1.1 billion in annual spending directly supporting over 15,000 jobs. What is that in Washington State? That's recreational fishing. Recreational fishing supports $1.1 billion in annual spending and over 15,000 jobs. If that were an individual company, we would be bending over backwards in Olympia to find a new tax break for them. But because it's fractured between thousands and thousands of individual different jobs and individuals working on the waterfront, we don't look at it that way, but we must. And we must consider that when we look at our commercial, industrial, working waterfronts, because they not only support the huge, incredible commerce and activities internationally from Washington State and elsewhere, but because I'm elected here, I don't really care about you guys. But in Washington State, they support that, but it's also those mom and pop jobs, and they're very real. The other thing that our industrial commercial waterfront support that we don't often think about is conservation. and research and education. And if we think there aren't jobs in conservation, research, and education, we are missing the boat, frankly. There are significant jobs. And let's, I want to dive into quickly a few bills, pieces of legislation here in Washington State, 2 of which are still alive and 1 of which is dead, thanks to somebody on the other side of the aisle. The first one I want to talk about is a piece of legislation that we're trying to move forward here that looks at restoring and doing restoration of toxic sites. So back to the idea that many of those commercial and industrial waterfronts, I don't believe we should spend the billions of dollars to try and turn them into something natural since they were devastated 100 years ago or more. But there are sites where we can do a significant ecological upgrade. And frankly, where we must do a significant ecological upgrade because those sites are toxic because of activities that we did a long time ago. And so it's not about finger pointing. It's not about saying, you know, ASARCO or somebody else, you're on the hook, although we do that too. It's about saying we need to clean them up so our communities are healthier and so we can redevelop those sites. And importantly right now, particularly in the economic situation we're just beginning to come out of, we're talking about jobs. So years ago, the voters of Washington State, in their brilliance, passed the Model Toxics Control Act, which puts a tax on first possessors of toxics coming into Washington State, generates money. This year there's $287 million, I believe, in that account. That account is set aside for, when we don't sweep it for something else, set aside for cleaning up toxic sites. Today there are 60 sites that are, I hate the term shovel-ready, but we'll say shovel-ready, within 2 to 24 months. That could employ thousands of people. And we're talking about cleaning up toxics. We're talking about making our waterfronts cleaner so that they can be reutilized as either industrial or commercial, or for God's sake, maybe you want to make a park and allow people to walk along the waterfront in some of those areas too. All of these things can come into play, and they're critical for our communities. And most importantly, they're critical economic drivers. And so we have the opportunity. And so what we're trying to do now with some legislation is fix the permitting process on that. It's very complicated to decide when something's clean when you're talking about some of the toxics we're talking about. But at the same time, the Port of Bellingham brought to my attention a few years ago, it took them 9 years to get a permit. The money was there, the people they wanted to hire were there, yet it took 9 years for the state to say, okay, you're blessed, go forth and clean it up. So what we're trying to do is streamline that a little bit. And I think that's really important to consider because nationally we have so many sites that need to be cleaned up. And there are jobs, very real, good-paying jobs that can do that. And so it's not, when we look at our commercial and industrial waterfronts, it's not just what can they be utilized for in the typical sense as far as commerce, trade, recreation, what have you. But let's look internally at what jobs we can create. And you're going to hear me say jobs at least 37 times this morning. What jobs we can create doing other really, really good things. Now, I also want to talk about Mayor Strickland's comments about the vision for how inclusive we need to be in our waterfront. So Washington State is the #1 producer of shellfish in the nation, and borderline, maybe I keep going back and forth with Bill Dewey and Bill Taylor, maybe the world. I mean, we produce a lot of shellfish here, and it's incredible. And it's an incredible economic driver. It's also a cultural thing that we got involved in a long time ago. We have generation after generation doing this. And so that isn't necessarily the sort of working waterfront or the commercial or industrial waterfront you'd think of when you look at an aquaculture farm, but it's absolutely critical and employs hundreds and hundreds of people in Washington State. Another one that you don't think of as necessarily a working waterfront, because half the time it's underwater, we have cranberry bogs in Washington State that are critical, which is why I have these up here. So when I walked in, so I don't know how I ever got elected in Washington State. You had 2 cups of coffee. I haven't done caffeine in 12 years. This is me without caffeine. You guys can imagine. Woo! So I drink a lot of orange juice. So I love orange juice. So I walked in. We have Ocean Spray, an incredible company here in Washington State. Yet, I'm sorry to do this to you. We have Tropicana orange juice. Ocean Spray makes really good orange juice, but we flew ours in with a carbon footprint from Florida this morning. So I can put up with that because Ocean Spray obviously doesn't get their oranges from Washington State, right? I think they're California. These are Florida. Anybody here from Florida? So, actually, ask me about Sunkist later. Your orange has got nothing on California. So I can understand maybe Tropicana orange juice because it's a fight, California, but Ocean Spray, we get the money then. But this is sacrilegious. We have cranberry juice outside from Florida. Now, I'm sure they bought their cranberries from us, so you can figure out your carbon footprint on that. But I just had to do a little jab there because Ocean Spray is a great company and a good example of another sort of working waterfront that we don't often think about. Now, let's talk about the bill that's dead. This died last week, and not because it wasn't a good bill. It died entirely out of political spite, which is the worst way to lose something. When something's a really good idea and it dies because, you know what, Congressman Kilmer and I were talking about this, and we served in the state senate together for a while, and he's anybody who's represented by Derek is lucky. That guy's brilliant and really kind. He's one of those people that when he asks you how you're doing, he actually wants to hear how you're doing. He doesn't want to hear fine. He's just a nice guy. We were talking about how very much, unfortunately, both at the federal level and now we're seeing it at the state level too, there's some folks who are party before country. They'd rather see their party, they'd rather see the country fail than their party lose a debate, which is unacceptable. And I'm not saying that's one party or another. I'm saying that there's individuals in both parties who are getting caught up in that, and it's unacceptable. I was elected to represent everybody in my district, not just the ones who voted for me. This bill I'm going to tell you about died because somebody didn't want me to have a win, not because it wasn't a good idea. And that sucks. Plus, it was my bill. So, and you guys will particularly, I think, appreciate this. The bill was titled the Working Waterfront Redevelopment Act. And what I was trying to do with that, it was brought to my attention by some folks who have a boatyard that they were trying to get a permit, a number of permits, because they wanted to do an upgrade for the facility. They realized they had some stormwater problems, and they wanted to upgrade it. They didn't have to. They were going to have to. I mean, it wasn't entirely out of the goodness of their heart. They saw some potential violations coming down the line. But they really wanted to make a difference. They wanted to do good by the environment on their industrial waterfront. They had to get 5 permits, spend thousands and thousands of dollars, and it took a whole bunch of time. And in the end, they ended up not doing it because it was too time-consuming for this smaller shipyard, and better called a boatyard. In this case, it was smaller. I talked to some folks at the Port of Bellingham. They shared with me similar ideas. I talked to some folks down here at Tacoma. They shared similar ideas. So I put together legislation that basically said, we're going to do one-stop shopping. If you can show that the project you're trying to do has an ecological benefit and that you're creating jobs, one stop. Instead of going to 4 state agencies, you're going to 1, and you will have your permit within 60 days. And now there's obviously very strict criteria. This is not if you're going to be a coal export facility. You're not going to get streamlined. But it was trying to look at some of the opportunities that we may have so that we can improve our working waterfronts in a way that benefits the environment but still maintains jobs. And it's critical. There's jobs. I think that was the 16th time now. So it's absolutely critical. And unfortunately, that bill's dead. I'll reintroduce it. The fun thing, and for those of you from Maine, I should have said this earlier. I serve on the advisory body for President Obama's National Ocean Council. I was appointed 2 years ago. I also am in the past chair of the Coastal States Caucus, which is an organization that represents coastal state legislators from every single coastal and Great Lakes state in the country. In wearing those hats, I travel a lot, and I work with other legislators from other states. I recently had a legislator from Maine. I have one from Florida. I know you guys are, they do some stuff down there that's good. A senator from Florida, state senator, as well as one from Maryland approached me about this working waterfronts bill and potentially replicating it. The ideas of, okay, how can we do this? And it's remarkable how similar our state laws are with regard to permitting. And it's not remarkable at all because we all have to be consistent with the federal. So, our local Shoreline Management Act has to be consistent with the Coastal Zone Management Act, blah, 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 blah. So all those things are similar in different states. So what we started is this dialogue, 1 minute, yeah, right. What we started is this dialogue around not just working waterfronts, but what I said in my very first intro of this idea of how can we combine, coastal conservation in a way that really makes our communities resilient, our coastal communities, and makes them places where we want to be, while still having critical economic drivers continue. And that dialogue is happening amongst many of us at the state level in several different states, and it's exciting. Also, Alaska, Oregon, and California are very involved in that dialogue. I'll move on. The last bill I wanted to touch on with you guys, which is still moving forward, and I have faith will be passed with the budget, is one looking at addressing ocean acidification. And many of you may say, well, what's ocean acidification? Maybe you don't. This looks like a pretty bright crowd. But the connection between ocean acidification and our working waterfronts is very clear, particularly when you look at the shellfish industry. We've lost hundreds of jobs in Washington State due to ocean acidification already. Taylor shellfish is in a serious discussion of, how can we stay here if we can't deal with this? Maybe we should go to places where it's not as active. But at the same time, Taylor shellfish and the industry has really stepped up. And we recently, with past Governor Gregoire, created the Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification to come up with recommendations. This legislation looks at advancing some of those recommendations, advancing some of those ideas, making sure we can get in front of this very important impact that's coming to our shorelines and impacting right now our mainly shellfish aquaculture, but all the scientists we're working with are saying every hardshell species. So what does that do to our crab harvest, which is huge in Washington State? What does it do in other states? Again, now we're having conversations with California, Oregon, Alaska, Maryland, Maine, Massachusetts. Are all involved in dialogue saying, okay, how can we replicate some of the ideas coming out of Washington State and get in front of this? We're also actively in conversations with CEQ and NOAA at the federal level saying, okay, how can you partner with us? How can you help us advance this? So we have legislation moving on at the state level. We also have discussions with our federal and tribal partners, which are critical, to try and address this. And those are examples of things that are critical to our waterfronts that we may not be thinking about as far as a working waterfront issue. And so in closing, Ron, you spoke about merging interests on our waterfronts. And what was interesting for me when I started thinking about the three pieces of legislation I'm actively working on or was working on this legislative session, which, by the way, I apologize, I'm going to have to run because I have to debate a climate denier in 40 minutes in Olympia. When I was thinking about these three pieces of legislation, it really does bring together these different merging interests. And I think the biggest thing that I would say on a political level is that if we're going to protect our endangered working waterfronts, we must look at it through a political lens. And that means we must consider what matters in my district, what matters in another politician's district. We are selfish, and we want to protect our districts. And so what matters in my district? I got a lot of shoreline. My industrial waterfronts matter. At the same time, though, I want to create jobs. And every single politician in the world, probably, but in the nation particularly, wants to create jobs. It's critical. And so we've got to tie together not just why the working waterfront is important, but why it matters for other reasons, jobs, the environment, and so on. So with that, I will say thank you for having me very much, and have a great day.
If you have any cards with questions on them, can you please hold them up so we can collect them now? I didn't mean to call Senator Kevin Ranker Steve. I don't even know why I did that. I've known him as Kevin all the years that I've known you. Yeah. But my sons I have three sons, Douglas, Daniel, and Aaron, and I've often mistakenly called Daniel Aaron and Aaron Daniel. So Daniel said, Dad, can you officiate my wedding? I said, yes. And then his fiancée, Akanksha, said, he'll have a sign saying, I am Daniel. When we do the officiating, didn't realize I was so obvious at mixing them up. So I do apologize, but evidently it's a habit I've acquired. But my mother, when she was mad at everybody in the family, she would call them Ronald. And my dad is James, and she called him Ronald. And she called my twin brother Donnie Ronald, and she called my oldest brother James Ronald whenever she was mad. So I wasn't mad at you. It's just probably genetics. Anyway, I have two questions already. One for Steve Goldbeck. What legal techniques are you applying to achieve your goals? For example, are you considering the things like transfer of development rights or TDRs or reductions in development rights?
Excuse me. Well, we're still at the let's figure it out stage, so we don't have all the nice pat answers I can trot out. The first thing we're doing politically, though, is trying to bring together the regional agencies that usually work in their own furrows and ignore each other, and we realize that we have to come together. So the state law set up something called the Joint Policy Committee, which brings together the regional agencies that I mentioned earlier to try to coordinate our planning so that instead of us doing our different planning, go, whoops, that doesn't work with what we're doing. We're actually working together at the front end to try to work these things out. The transfer of development is a great idea as our rolling easements, but they had those in Texas and they basically have stopped doing them because they're so controversial. We're really going to have to look, we think, at setting up some kind of, excuse me, infrastructure development bank approach or something like that in the region because it's going to be expensive. We're not going to do it through regulation. We're going to do it through coming up with cooperative programs. And so that's what we think is the more fruitful approach. But again, as I said before, our governance has to come at the hind end. We really have to figure out what our challenges are before we figure out what the mechanisms are to implement them.
For all of you, one of the things that I'm going to merge two questions here. We've all watched the political debate on climate change and how to make things work, but do you think that Hurricane Sandy is changing the resiliency conversation? Each of you can respond to that. 1 minute.
We'll see. It has not done it previously. I mean, Katrina didn't do it. I mean, we're still trying to protect, a major city that's below sea level. Hopefully, I see some indications, from the governor there in New York, certainly the mayor, where there's thinking, okay, there's certain things we have to protect. We can't just move the subway from that. So there's a rationale for protection. But when you look at residential areas, and whether the Jersey Shore, and you got all these memories, and it's wonderful, and you want it for your grandkids and your granddaughter who's perfect, we've got to overcome that emotional attachment to what was to, the reality of tomorrow. So I'm hopeful that maybe they'll do something there on the residential side.
Hurricane Sandy wasn't as large an event in northern New England as it was in southern New England and certainly in New York and New Jersey. But we've had other storms that have touched us, and I think it's personal experience that will accumulate over time. The more that people experience sea level rise as something that they can see, the more it will pervade the general conversation around resiliency and infrastructure, regardless of cause. We can point to pieces of infrastructure that we've seen changing within our own lifestyle. I like to go to a little beach right in Portland, in the city, and there's a street monument laying down in the sand. We didn't put the street monument on the beach. The beach came to the street monument, it laid down, and now we sit on it and the dogs pee on it. You can point to it, and you need to take people there and show them, because they won't recognize that it's a street monument. It's just a piece of granite, and it's our job to show people what coastal erosion looks like in an urban environment, and then they will get it. So when you have a king tide, like we had probably might have been the same tide, we went for a walk, and we invited people to go for a walk and see what it looks like. Beautiful sunny day, people driving through the water. They don't know it's seawater. It comes up through the sewers. It's just a puddle. So Sandy, yes, it will pervade the conversation, not in Maine right now, but every single personal experience will help us get to a point where we can have a real conversation.
We found in San Francisco Bay that it has has changed things a little bit. And of course, there's a window of opportunity of these things. You know, right after the storm hits, everybody wants to do something to fix that, and then after a while, something else happens, and they get distracted and they forget about it. But it's the whole climate change and sea level rise thing, in most people's attention span, is just somewhere out there. And the nice thing about Sandy, which was a terrible thing, and I'm sorry that it happened, but the only good thing I can say about it is it brought that thing out of the future to today. So people saw, wow, things could get really screwed up. This is something we really need to think and talk about. And we found that folks who before weren't interested in talking about this topic are now more interested in addressing it.
What I would add is that on a political, so yesterday we passed a bill. I was prime sponsor of Governor Inslee's climate change bill. Off the House floor, we already got it out of the Senate. That's a big deal. And the way we got it out of the Senate, with the other side being in control, is they demanded that we remove all of the intent language. So we had to remove all the language that talked about why there was a climate problem, how it was impacting us, and so on, and move forward with just what we were going to do about it. And what I found, and I wasn't kidding, and I don't know how many minutes now, I have to be in Olympia because I need to debate this guy who's coming in to say the world is flat. You can see where I stand on this issue. The reality is, however, that politically, I believe things like ocean acidification that very clearly are impacting jobs in our state due to impacts from climate are real, and it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, where you are on the climate debate, you want to do something about protecting those jobs. And so what I'm getting at is, I think where we need to move away from is, frankly, there's enough science. It's very clear, at least to me, climate change is real. So let's do something about it. But if I have to not talk about the fact that climate change is real and I just move into action, that's okay. And so politically, sometimes that's necessary.
Either yes or no. Do we, I'm listening to your responses, so I'm just really curious, do we have to have catastrophes in order to motivate people?
Yes. Proven fact.
Crisis creates community.
Yes, absolutely.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Not that we want to encourage them. I actually agree as well. We have, interesting in science, we talk about sea rise and we talk about tides. We tend to say we're going to have, but the real issue is, do you think that climate change is affecting tides, or is tides beyond the climate change? It's just going to be the rising sea levels and tides that are going to be the factor. Are they interdependent or not?
We're experiencing higher levels of the water, and the amplitude of the tide is probably swinging a little higher as well, the highs and lows. But in general, the water is going places that it didn't used to, both in storms and on a daily event. There's a Whole Foods in Portland where the trees died in the tree wells, and we couldn't figure out why the mulch kept disappearing. It's because it floated away, regularly.
Don't want to get wonky, but we did actually have modelers who came in and looked at how sea level rise would change the tides in San Francisco Bay, and found that some of the tides would be higher, but the main thing that would happen is, because of the higher sea level, you're going to get bigger waves, and the wave fetch is going to increase. And that was one of the main things they saw in their modeling. But the real impact, of course, that most of us are going to see are the storm events. When a big storm comes in, or you have a king tide and you have a storm on that sea level rise signal, that's when you're really going to see the big impacts. And the interesting thing is some of the work we're doing showing that the impact may be less on the shoreline with the waves coming in, but more that the storm water can't get off the land. And so you can build a nice big seawall to protect yourself, and the water just comes right up through the storm drains and floods you from inside. Something to look forward to.
We've had a great panel. The issue about, do you need catastrophes to alter public opinion? And everybody kind of saying in their own way, yeah. I always say that it's always important to be able to seize the moment. You have two responsibilities today because you have the skills for them. One is that we'd like to avert those, but the issue is to do as much as we can to prepare for them, and then to be able to act quickly on them, and then to put as much prevention now as possible. So your task is pretty easy. You got to change the attitudes of your citizens, of your future generations, and of humankind generally. Other than that, but no, if you think that's impossible, shame on you. You're skilled. You're skilled. You're skilled. And you're smart. And you've been given this gift of day not to retire and not to hide your talents and your skills. You've been given this gift of day to do remarkable things. And in closing, I have 3 sons who I have loved. I've loved them all their lives. I have liked them more recently because they're financially emancipated, I think. But the one thing that my oldest did is he asked me, I remember getting a letter from his school that said, "Dear Mr. Sims, thank you for volunteering to be the parent chaperone on the Mount Rainier climb. Mount Rainier is 14,000 feet. It stands out there majestically. You're taking in 1/3 less oxygen than you're taking in right now in this room. So you walk and deliberately take a breath." And I remember telling my wife when I got the letter from his school, I said, "Look what the sadist did to me this time." I learned a lot on that mountain. I learned that the young men's views of young women were wrong. Young women don't climb up mountains, they fly up mountains. And that young men can handle heavier loads, and that people my age know, literally and figuratively, that mountains are conquered one step at a time. But the joy of Mount Rainier, its exquisite joy, the coldest, sweetest, soul-felt fresh air you will ever breathe, a horizon that has no end, the ability to touch every star at night. The joy of that mountain was the lesson I learned. Everybody counts on a rope team. You're as strong as the weakest member, and you are as fast as the slowest member. Everybody counts. In this room is an exquisite team. So when you go to your sessions, do not sit next to somebody who you already know. Introduce yourself and learn to build the rope team of the participants in this room with different life experiences, different challenges, different values, but brought together because it is time for us to make sure that our kids have better lives and that we're safe, and that our economies will continue to grow. America that has not been a world power, America that is the youngest superpower in history. We've only been a superpower since World War II. We are a new culture. If we wish to be a culture of the 21st and 22nd centuries that is outstanding, that people want to be like, that people see innovation and joy, then you have a lot of work to do, but we can do it. We can do it. So thank you very much. We'll end this session. I want to thank the panelists. We give them applause for all their work.